Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Today, we are going to talk about midlife, which a number of listeners have requested, and which was a really significant part of Carl Jung's work. He was really the first psychologist to map the trajectory of the second half of life. Most before that focused on the formative childhood years and traumas and so on. For Jung, the second half of life, starting with that tipping point that we call midlife, was a time of very, very important possibility for personal growth and for individuation, the coming fully into one's own potential and unique selfhood. So with that, I think we're off and running on a very big topic. I have come to think of midlife as a tipping point. And my image for it is climbing up a mountain in the first half of life, of establishing yourself in the world. You get an education, you get a job, maybe you get married, you have children, you save up, you get a mortgage, and then you get to the top of that mountain somewhere along the line in the mid-40s or mid-50s, whenever. And then you're on the other side. Now, maybe you're only on the other side a little tiny bit, but all of a sudden, something is radically different. You're looking at another whole landscape, and for Jung, it was an inner landscape, that the mortgage and the kids and social clubs of, like that old song, had it, is that all there is? Mm-hmm. And we're off on another quest, but it's not a quest any longer in the external world. We're in the internal world.
Well, it can be a time, I think classically, the classical midlife crisis that we think about, which I don't think necessarily fits that many people's experience, but be that as it may, the classical conceptualization of it is, yes, you put all this energy into creating this outer life, and then you achieve it, and then you think, oh my God, now what? And it's a real sense of disillusionment. I'm thinking of that Talking Head song, you may find yourself in a beautiful house with a beautiful wife behind the wheel of a large automobile, and you may say to yourself, well, how did I get here? It's, and this is again, the kind of cliche is that this is when the divorce happens, or this is when the affairs happen, or you buy a new car or whatever. But there's a sense of really, we're talking about meaning, right? Because you recognize that the chase that you've been on, once you've caught your quarry, has been lacking in meaning to an extent, or now the meaning has migrated.
Yeah, I think the first half of life has great meaning. It's not to denigrate those kinds of achievements or failures out there in the world. But the second half of life, I think, just calls us to something more, to take stock, to figure out what we really value, what are we really in service to.
When I hold that differentiation between the first and second half of life, I see this image of a river, and in the first half of life, we're carried on this river, and the river is social expectations, familial patterns. We're paying Caesar what is due Caesar, establishing the families that the culture expects of us that we've integrated. And sometime right around midlife, our boat hits the shore and we step out on solid ground. And it's that transition from being carried by the culture to finally standing and deciding where we're going to go and what's the unique journey that we're going to take.
Yeah, that's a lovely image, because it makes this point that you achieve this degree of consciousness that you can make choices about where you go, that you don't have to just take it on faith that you need to go in a certain direction.
And then when we hit shore and we're standing there, then a whole cascade of questions opens up. For instance, where's my compass? Do I have a compass? Do I have a map? As I survey the inner and outer terrain, what are the values, signals, or signs that I use to decide what's more attractive or what direction I'm going to move towards? And those are all of a sudden these deep and sometimes existential questions, which aren't perhaps even necessary in the first half of life as we follow what's expected and what's common.
I'm thinking, too, that this is a time, I think our images are making it sound like we transition from one kind of orientation to another, when often it's very fraught with anxiety and inner turmoil and discontent, that holding the tension between the spiritual drive to develop of something here has not fulfilled me, either because I did achieve my dreams and it's not enough, or my dreams did not bear fruit and that's not enough. So the inner drive to develop and these the yearnings to stay in the known in terms of values and achievements of maybe I'll buy a bigger house, or we'll go on a special vacation, or buy a motorcycle, of which way do we go internally? Stick with our old values, cultural expectations, or develop something altogether new that it is very hard to articulate. And to just call it a spiritual yearning it's sort of a broad brush, vague term that doesn't really provide much direction. I'm thinking of you, Joseph, saying we're on the shore and where's my compass? The problem is I forgot to bring a compass. I got to figure it out some other way.
As in, didn't even know we needed a compass.
Yeah, it's a struggle.
And Jung will often talk and write about midlife as his transition out of the child's psychology into what he imagined to be the adult psychology, and speaks in rather intense terms about sacrificing the child position, which, as you've said, is no small thing and comes at a tumultuous price.
And of course, Jung had this very dramatic version of a midlife crisis, right? I mean, he was kind of thrown into the need to perform as an adult at a young age because his father died. And so he had to take over a lot of responsibility and support his mother and his sister. And he went to medical school and he became a doctor and he got married and he worked at the Berkeley under Eugene Bleuler. And he established himself. He, did some important research and wrote some papers and was kind of a young buck. And then also in that time became a colleague of Freud. And then he had his confrontation with the unconscious. And I think he was about 37 when that happened, or something around there. And it was a profound collapse of his former priorities, of his former values. To think about it another way, he talked about personality 1 and personality 2 when he was in his childhood. He said he felt like he had this kind of dual aspect. And personality 1 was the personality that was out in the world dealing with consensual reality, and personality 2 had this kind of eternal quality to it, in which he was almost kind of like always an old man. And, for a long time, he just put personality 2 on the shelf when he was out there in the world, establishing a career and having a family and getting married and having kids and setting up his career. And then that just got sort of blown away. And he was dropped into this deep, deep place where he was really immersed in the unconscious. And of course, that's where the material from the Red Book comes.
What I am really taking from what you just said, Lisa, is what a struggle it can be and how painful it can be. That Jung was forced to sacrifice who he had been, what he was in service to. It had been a fairly unconflicted career path. He was successful. And then he was catapulted into spending his mornings sitting on the shore of Lake Zurich, building little villages out of the stones by the shore.
Yeah, and talking to Philemon. and
talking to himself or to his other selves. There's a plunge into a kind of inner turmoil that is a part of this.
And part of the tumult may be that Jung was forced to discover the autonomy of the psyche, that in the first half of life, reasonably so, we believe that we are the masters of our fate and we're steering everything, that the ego and the conscious decisions are really crafting everything that's happening. And for Jung, the horrifying and amazing revelation is there is an inner world populated with all kinds of figures that have a huge influence on him and agendas that are not even remotely related to his outer conscious life. And that is often thought of as a awakening of the religious function, that the world and the psyche are animated uniquely and independently. I have a quote here where Jung writes a little bit about that. Among all my patients in the second half of life, that is to say over 35, there has been not one whose problem in the last resort was not that of finding a religious outlook on life. It is safe to say that every one of them fell ill because he had lost what the living religions of every age have given to their followers, and none of them has been really healed who did not regain his religious outlook. This, of course, has nothing to do with a particular creed or membership of a church. So, Jung used the word religious differently than we would in our modern culture. He really meant a spiritual awakening and a connection to an inner side of life.
I'm thinking about what it is we're in service to, of the something greater, which for Jung was the self with a capital S, something that undergirds the ego, the second center of the personality, the unconscious psyche, soul, and that we recognize that that is greater than just our own sense of I. I like this, I'm going here, I want that. And that it has very much to do with individuation, of becoming what we have the innate potential to become. And there's a nice quote from the Gospel of Thomas, which is often considered the fifth gospel. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you don't bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you.
So the second half of life can be a time that we reconnect with the unlived life. We go back and we find those aspects of self that were important, that may be vital to our being who we were meant to be in this lifetime, but which we haven't developed or perhaps even really known about consciously.
And some of this was really neatly, tidily talked about in Jung's work on typology, that the various functions of the personality over time require their opposite to be developed, which is latent in the unconscious. So every extrovert at some point in the arc of the life must discover their introversion. Sensation-seeking people discover their intuition, feeling types, discover their thinking function, and vice versa. That there is this larger potential in the personality structure, which is separate from any particular goal. So we may not necessarily wake up and think, oh, I have this great novel that I'm destined to write, although that does happen for some people. But more that I have to experience how other people process and orient to life, that a stance towards the general life begins to shift.
So we could almost say that midlife transition, especially when it's sort of experienced in this classical sense that we've been talking about it, is a kind of enantiodromia, where one thing kind of flows into its opposite. I'm thinking also a number of writers on midlife have made this important point that oftentimes gender roles tend to flip a little bit at midlife. Men often become softer and more nurturing. I've definitely seen that in people, and women, maybe a woman who stayed at home most of her life, or kind of her interests circled around the family, she may really become a kind of fierce warrior in midlife.
That word, I'm going back to the word enantiodromia, which was one of the first words I read about when I was taking my very first seminar in Jungian studies. I looked it up in the dictionary and I didn't find it. And I called up the seminar person and said, do you know what this word means? And of course he said, yes, I do. And you'll find out too if you come to the seminar. But for our listeners, it means counter and running, or running counter to, which is what I think you're talking about, of we go and develop some of our less developed potential.
Well, we may even engage in things that are the opposite.
Exactly.
Of what we once valued or believed about ourselves, you know?
And so Jung talked about that as they're in one's inferior functions. And not inferior because they're not valuable, but inferior because the life force hasn't had an opportunity to circle around them and light them up and make them a priority. So we do see this where, people who've lived a very intellectual life suddenly, take up community theater.
Yeah.
And Jung also advised, by the way, never make your career out of your inferior function.
I'll remember that.
Because it feels really incredibly numinous.
Yeah.
To be in the opposite function.
Jung's midlife crisis, if we're calling it that, which he called his confrontation with the unconscious, was catalyzed by his break with Freud, which really plunged him into this dark place. And such crises in our lives might be sparked by a failure. He says, nothing endangers a connection with the unconscious more in a man than a successful life. It makes him forget his dependence on the unconscious. And so there can be the way that a particular kind of failure, maybe a failure in the personal life, maybe there's a divorce, or maybe a failure at work, something dries up, can set us on a kind of midlife quest to discover the other sides of ourselves and our unlived life.
There's a wonderful poem about that. This is just one stanza by Antonio Machado about the importance of failures. Last night, as I was sleeping, I dreamt, marvelous error, that I had a beehive here inside my heart, and the golden bees were making white combs and sweet honey from my old failures.
That's great. That's great.
So whether it's external world success in sort of material and visible and culturally approved ways, or whether it's perceived failure, which is what happened to Jung. His world fell apart. There is opportunity here.
And if we take a deep Jungian stance, it's interesting to even challenge the idea of a failure, that the unconscious in its enormous wisdom and power is more than capable of orienting us in such a way that we make a fatal mistake, or we just trip over a root, so to speak, that's popped up under the ground, and then we take a tumble. Often when people describe something they call a failure, we can trace it back to very distinct moments in their decisions, in their movement around a circumstance. And even if we can't do that through a specific action, we can adopt an attitude that we are co-participating in these complex, painful events, and that the self is more than able to do that, to force growth.
Right. The self is orchestrating this for our own growth. And, in a kind of film example where that kind of didn't happen is Citizen Kane, where the protagonist of the film, Citizen Kane, he's just so successful. He never has that moment where he trips on a root. And when he dies, there's all of this kind of unredeemed, unlived life.
I have another lovely quote where Jung talks about this phenomena, or writes about it. The nearer we approach to the middle of life, and the better we have succeeded in entrenching ourselves in our personal attitudes and social positions, the more it appears as if we had discovered the right course and the right ideals and principles of behavior. For this reason, we suppose them to be eternally valid, and to make a virtue of unchangeability, clinging to them. We overlook the essential fact that the social goal is attained only at the cost of a diminution of personality. Many, far too many aspects of life, which should have been experienced, lie in the lumber room among dusty memories, but sometimes, too, they are glowing coals, the ashes.
I love that idea of glowing coals.
So I'm thinking about what propels us forward and what stops us from this kind of inner quest of finding a deeper meaning in our life. And I'm kind of circling around the idea that it's fear of how hard it is to leave sort of the known. Do I really dare to quit my job? There are wonderful movie scenes where somebody comes home and announces, that's it, I'm done, I quit, as if that's the great burst for freedom. But I think facing our inner world and standing up to our fear is the hardest part of it, and also an essential part of it.
Sort of the fear to face the doubts that come to us at midlife, would you say?
The doubts and the risks of departing from cultural norms, expectations, values. And I'm not thinking about it so concretely as, now, okay, I'm just going to leave and, explore the Arctic. But what it means to leave the comfort of those internal structures, that this is the way life is. These are the norms.
Well, I think that in the beginning of life, it's advantageous for us to submit to the social norms. I think about the young people that I have in my practice, 18, 19, 20, 21, that sometimes it's an embracing of the requirements of life that is essential. Sometimes young people are overly interested in internal factors which then set them at odds with the requirements of the world. But at midlife, when the self initiates the challenge to go in a different path, I think it can be fear that stirs up in people. I think it can also be resentment, as Lisa said, disillusionment. It can be an ambivalence about giving up comfort. There is a lot of unresolved maternal and paternal complexes where we are hesitant to leave the soft reassurance of what we've built up. So I think fear is definitely there. I think over the years I've heard people describe their defenses against change in so many different ways. And change itself, which by the way has become a whole area of psychological consideration, is complicated for people in general.
Yeah, so one of the things we're talking about is the way that we can resist the call to change.
Mm-hmm.
So at midlife, we may experience this demand from the unconscious to reorient, and that's frightening. And there's fear there, and we may want to resist it. And that may be when we engage in something that we've referred to before on the podcast called the regressive restoration of the persona. So maybe you've made partner, you've got the wife and the kids, and it's like, oh God, my God, how did I get here? And you are faced with a drop into a meaninglessness, or having to confront, is there meaning, or where is the meaning, or what is the rest of my life about? And instead of doing that, you buy a fancy new sports car. That would be a way of avoiding the demand of the unconscious rather than engaging it.
That we can get trapped in grasping for outer concrete symbols of our youth or our early youth.
Mm-hmm.
At 50, I'm sitting here, my body's becoming a jalopy. And there's a great fantasy about buying a $100,000 car as a beautiful replacement for this personal vehicle, which is dinged up.
But, I want to bring us back to the inner journey, because there's the temptation is to keep on striving after something in the outer world that you haven't ever really gotten that would indicate success, or you have the outer world markers of success and you want to go out and buy a Lamborghini. But whether you do that or not, the real issue is, what am I doing between me and me, between my ego and the unconscious, and that the sacrifice may be to stay in the same job, in the same house, same family, but you're coming from a different place.
Yeah, you're working on this as an inner issue.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where the rubber hits the road. It's not with the Lamborghini.
So, right. Of course. I mean, I think my point, just to make sure it's clear, is buying the Lamborghini would be avoiding the call to attend to the inner life.
Yes.
And we would consider that a regressive restoration of the persona. So
I think we're really impacting sales of Lamborghini here this week.
I'm finding myself drawn this week's topic to Jung's book, Symbols of Transformation, which is volume 5. And interestingly, it's a book he wrote right around his own midlife, right before that confrontation with the unconscious, and you can really see it bubbling up. And one of the quotes that I think is relevant to what we're talking about, this sort of fear, is he says, paragraph 458, he says, the demands of the unconscious act at first like a paralyzing poison on a man's energy and resourcefulness, so that it may well be compared to the bite of a poisonous snake. Apparently, it is a hostile demon who robs him of energy, but in actual fact, it is his own unconscious whose alien tendencies are beginning to check the forward striving of the conscious mind. So the unconscious is making this demand on the conscious mind to turn inward. That's what's being asked of us at these times.
I think as we yield to the inner life, one of the delights and disharmonies that we experience looks like becoming eccentric.
Yes.
I'm reminded of a really charming poem which has been around for a long time. When I'm an old woman, I shall wear purple with a red hat which doesn't go and doesn't suit me. And I shall spend my pension on brandy and summer gloves and satin sandals, and say we've no money for butter. I shall sit down on the pavement when I'm tired and gobble up samples in shops and press alarm bells and run my stick along the public railings and make up for the sobriety of my youth. I shall go out in my slippers in the rain and pick flowers in other people's gardens. And you can wear terrible shirts and grow more fat and eat 3 pounds of sausages at a go, or only bread and pickle for a week, and hoard pens and pencils and beer mats and things in boxes. But now we must have clothes that keep us dry, and pay our rent, and not swear in the street, and set a good example for the children. We must have friends to dinner and read the papers. But maybe I ought to practice a little now, so people who know me are not too shocked and surprised when suddenly I'm old and start to wear purple.
That's absolutely great. Perfect. Of the sense of joy and freedom.
Yes, and because you've let go of the need to adhere to conventional values. You know, one of my favorite accounts on Twitter, for those of you on Twitter, it's such a great account. The account is Sophia Cycles, and it's run by this wonderful novelist, and she just fills her timeline with these wonderful quotes from Jung or Jungian authors or kind of similar books. And she posted this one just a few days ago, and I just love it. And I've been thinking about it ever since I read it. So this is the quote: "The job of the elder is to be nuttier, more curious, occasionally fierce, and more connected to the eccentricities of wildness than the youth ever dreamed. More than anything, the elder has seen some rough pattern to their life and knows how to express it through a story. This carries tremendous hope with it." So I love that. If we're answering the call to attend to the inner life at midlife, we will become nuttier, which feels just right to me.
Yes. Doesn't that sound like a lot more fun and more authentic than buying a Lamborghini?
Yeah. Yeah. So this brings to mind Erickson's stages of psychosocial development. So Erikson was a 20th century psychologist, and he was, along with Jung, one of the few people who really mapped psychological development over the entire course of a lifetime. And he had these wonderful psychosocial stages of development. And so, you know, he tracks them. It's first trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt, initiative versus guilt. By the time that we're in our 20s, it's intimacy versus isolation. So that's the stage from 21 to 39. That's kind of establishing a relationship, becoming partnered. But then 40 begins a stage that he calls generativity versus stagnation. So at this point, you orient toward kind of leaving something to the world, whether or not that's actual biological children or being generative and creative in some other way. And then at 65 and older, you're at something he calls ego integrity versus despair. And the idea is, if you've more or less successfully met these different challenges throughout the lifespan, you'll be at the state of ego integrity. And if you haven't met them, you might be more in a despair place. And it is true that when you look at older people who perhaps didn't meet the midlife demand of kind of almost rewriting their story or reinventing themselves, sometimes you see people that seem a little ossified. They may be filled with bitterness and resentment. versus people that seem to have retained some kind of psychological flexibility throughout their lives. And then they can be this kind of wonderfully nutty, fierce, curious kind of person. And I want to tell a little story of the first training seminar that I went to when I had first gotten into training. Harry Wilmer was presenting, and he was a famous, renowned analyst. And I was like, well, I better go to that. I wanted to be a really good student, so I'm going to go. It was a presentation on yarn paintings, and I was thinking, well, that kind of sounds like a sleeper. I mean, what is that? Some kind of like indigenous. I thought it was going to be like some sort of like looking at indigenous artwork, and
and you know what? I was there, and I thought it was going to be like making pot holders. We were going to see some loving hands at home.
So I went, and he stood up. He was in his 80s, and he stood up, and just there was something kind of very frail about him. And he took the mic, and he started talking about how when he was he had tuberculosis in World War II, and he was in confinement on a Navy vessel for like over a year, I think. And he just spontaneously started making these paintings by kind of embroidering with yarn on cloth. I mean, it was just something that his psyche asked of him, and he did it. And he continued doing it for the rest of his life. And he showed us these slides of them, and they were, like beautiful and colorful, but it really wasn't the point. It was childlike. There was something childlike about it. He had lost his adult son in a motorcycle accident, and he showed us one that he had made in the aftermath of that horrible tragedy. So he was responding playfully, just like Jung did in his confrontation with the unconscious, when he was like building little villages with pebbles at the back of his house at 37 or however old he was. And I was so moved. I think I cried through the whole presentation. And then I ran into Deb later, and I said, did you go to that? And Deb, you just said, I did. I cried the whole way through. So it wasn't just me. And then, so a few days later, there was the banquet. So at every Jungian training, every interregional meeting, there's always a banquet.
A bacchanal.
And, it's like you eat the bad hotel food, right? And then the band gets up, and I'm sort of like dreading it. I'm thinking it's going to be like the last wedding I went to, where like maybe a couple people dance or something. The music started, and, 200 chairs scraped. And all of a sudden, everyone was on the dance floor. All of these analysts, most of them in their 70s and 80s, dancing on this dance floor that was too crowded. And they just danced the whole night. And I thought, oh my God, I guess I've landed in the right place. Like this is what that looks like. I think that ego integrity. Yeah. If you navigate the midlife challenge well, you wind up having you can endlessly invigorate yourself in some way.
Yeah. I think what you're saying, Lisa, is so important because it's the feeling. We know when we're with somebody that has that, whether it's when I'm old, I shall wear purple, or all these septuagenarians, people in their 70s, whatever that longer, better word is, are out on the dance floor. Or Harry Wilmer making these startling yarn paintings. We see the soul. We feel it. We know it. We recognize it. We're wrapping a lot of words around it today because that's what we do, and this is the podcast. But we all know it inherently and intrinsically. Mm-hmm. And that's what it's about.
Yep. So there's this other really amazing quote from Jung in Volume 5, talking about this kind of ossification that can happen. He says, if we wish to stay on the heights we have reached, we must struggle all the time to consolidate our consciousness and its attitude. So we have to keep on restoring that persona. But we soon discover that this praiseworthy and apparently unavoidable battle with the years leads to stagnation and desiccation of the soul. Our convictions become platitudes ground out on a barrel organ. Our ideals become starchy habits. Enthusiasm stiffens into automatic gestures.
Wow.
The source of the water of life seeps away. We ourselves may not notice it, but everybody else does. And that is even more painful.
Mm.
So there's a price to be paid for not taking the inner road. I mean, what a stark contrast there between people out there on the dance floor or this kind of ossification.
Yeah.
And this is it, kids. I think a lot of the time, this is it. This is the only life you're going to get right here, right now, on this planet, in this body, with these opportunities and those struggles. But this is it. And everything we do in life, we do with ourselves. So what are we going to do here?
Yeah, so we would recommend don't buy the Lamborghini. Take that money you would have spent on the Lamborghini and get into Jungian analysis.
Do you think we're going to hear from the Lamborghini CEO about stop bashing his product? There is joy to be had.
Maybe this is the time we can joyously transition into a dream.
Okay.
Hi, this is Lisa from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing the podcast involves substantial expenses, and we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month, and at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
Okay, today's dream comes from a woman, and she is 54 years old, and she's a social worker. She says, I'm walking with a group of my clients, she says developmentally disabled people. I have to work to keep the group together as some straggle here and there. I'm responsible for their well-being, so onward we go. I look on the ground sidewalk and see a small, round, brown object which looks like a tree nut. I pick it up and upon closer inspection, realize that it is of animal nature rather than plant and alive. As I hold it in the palm of my hand, it morphs into a tiny creature, tinier than my pinky finger. I can't just leave it there, so I slip it into my pocket and keep walking, trying to keep my ragtag group together. After a while, I look into my pocket to check on it, and it has grown some and looks a little bit like a fetal kitten. It looks unwell, and I think it might not live. We continue to walk. The third time I look into my pocket, the creature has turned into a baby bird with black, red, and white feathers. The bird is in tremendous suffering, with its stomach cut open and a look of horror, pain, and grief on its face. I feel these emotions too and think, oh no, it's going to die. I keep it in my pocket and try to soothe it, but still we keep on walking. Toward the end of our escapade, I look into my pocket a fourth time. The bird is fully grown and leaps out, startling me. Now the bird is pure white, luminous, with 3 round feathers on slim stalks atop its head. Among its body feathers are multicolored zinnia flowers sprouting along with the feathers. It hops into a landscape planter along the sidewalk and establishes itself amid the vegetation. I back away in shock, completely amazed. I pull out my cell phone to try to take a picture of it, but can't because a survey keeps popping up on the screen of my phone, preventing me from using the camera. I curse and search my bag for another phone and finally do manage to snap a pic, but I still don't know what to make of it. And here's the context that she provides. She says the dream occurred in the spring of 2018. The years prior, the 8 years prior, were very traumatic with multiple losses, a medical catastrophe, and a complete emotional and physical collapse. My view of myself, my life, and my future had to be dismantled and rebuilt from scratch, while the things I needed but did not want were by necessity retained, as I understood that the only way out is through. And the feelings in the dream were protectiveness, working hard but in futility, and surprise. And for a final bit of context, she says, the clients of the dream were real developmentally disabled people to whom I provided care 30 years ago. Well, this I think is an image of a successful midlife passage.
Oh, it's a really beautiful, beautiful dream, and reminds me so much of what we were saying about Harry Wilmer and his yarn paintings, and Jung sitting on by Lake Zurich and building villages out of stones. And she has this dream.
Mm-hmm. So when I see that she's walking with a group of clients to whom she provides care and they're developmentally disabled, this could possibly be an image of an ego that is attending to some wounded or developmentally delayed aspects of herself.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of a metaphor for what she needs to do on an inner level that she is doing.
Exactly. I think that's right on, that she is doing the care and the dutiful care of those parts of herself. Although I also wondered if that was her work in some outer world way as well.
Well, she did say that,
mm-hmm.
Yes.
And then there is the metamorphosis of this round brown object that looks like a tree nut and then becomes a tiny figure, and it keeps changing.
Well, so to start off with, she notices the little brown object on the ground. And it's almost like that alchemical thing about the philosopher's stone is found in the dung heap. I mean, she looks down and she finds this thing, and it's spherical. So it starts off as there's an intimation of wholeness already because it's round. It looks like a nut, which could be a self-image. So there's a sense of already embedded in the beginning. There is a sense of eventual wholeness, but then it goes through these transmogrifications.
And isn't that lovely that she looks down? It's small. It's not some luminous orb in the sky. And it's brown. It couldn't be more ordinary. And she notices it.
Mm-hmm.
And takes it in.
And puts it in her pocket.
Mm-hmm.
And then she continues, just as she continues to care for the developmentally disabled people that she's with, she's keeping her ragtag group together, even though it's a little challenging. She's also attending to this precious tiny thing that is going through these transformations. Joseph, you look like you're thinking very hard. I have a feeling you're going to come up with something really surprising and brilliant any second.
Well, there's a good setup.
I think the dream for me lives in possibly several different levels simultaneously. On one level, I can imagine that it really is a dream about her clients, that on some level she may not have understood as fully as she now can in retrospect. When I think about her developmentally delayed clients, the things that she finds on the ground represent these kind of developmental images. They're these tiny little neonatal possibilities. She slips them in a pocket very much like a marsupial would.
Yes.
Like a kangaroo or some other marsupial creature. But she lacks a nipple in her pocket, which marsupials have. So when a kangaroo neonate crawls up into the pocket, they can nurse inside of there, that it's actually an environment that can allow it to gestate. Here, she keeps it in the pocket and she looks at it, but perhaps it's a pocket made out of felt or something like that. So the neonate continues to struggle in this suffering, premature way. So in the midst of all of that suffering, and perhaps even a life of suffering, there is an enormous luminous spirituality that is not visible at first. So I'm wondering if in this moment her unconscious is asking her to re-examine her perception of these developmentally delayed people whose outer lives may seem full of suffering and undeveloped, and yet their inner lives may be an enormous, luminous life that she could not have appreciated then, but now, having been through her own suffering, she may be able to perceive the secret internal life of these people.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think the fact that it was from 30 years ago, usually when someone brings in old material like that, I think that, the way I usually hear that is that it's about more a sense that we're in the subjective realm, and that the psyche has kind of pulled this image to show something about the dreamer. But of course, it can always be a both and too.
That's what I was thinking. It's several different simultaneous levels.
I'm also really, really struck by the fact that, let's see. Well, first of all, there are four times that she looks. And of course, 4 is an important number. We think of 4 as the number of wholeness, of a cycle reaching its completion. And I want to just see, it's the third time the creature has black, red, and white feathers.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, those are important alchemical colors that indicate the different aspects of transformation, the nigredo, the rubedo, the albedo. So that's another indication that there is a cycle underway. There is a change, something is changing. And finally, when it's when it has completed, that's when when it has the black, red, and white feathers, that's when it's in suffering and the stomach is cut open. So, that is like life is really having its way with us. We're really in a transformation state, and that is often very painful. And sometimes we don't know if we're going to make it. And the final time, the bird is all white, except for these zinnia feathers. And of course, so I thought that was interesting that the zinnia flowers come back. So it's animal, but it's also vegetable. It starts off like a nut and it ends with sort of like a bird flower.
One of my associations to that final image has to do with the 8th tarot card, Strength. And in that depiction, there's a red lion that is being tamed and contained by a woman in white who has flowers sprouting out of the top of her head.
Oh, how cool.
One of the hermetic interpretations of that image is that the sexual force, which is portrayed as the red lion in its highly instinctive state, has been sublimated up into the higher brain functions, and the flowers as sexual organs in the vegetative kingdom are rising up out of the consciousness. So the white, luminous bird with zinnias sprouting out of its head, to me, represents a spiritualization and a sublimation of the primal and problematic energies in the first 3 images.
Well, and of course, the fact that it winds up being a bird, it starts off as a nut, and then it's some kind of tiny creature, and then it's a cat, and then it's eventually a white bird, does definitely track this idea that it's kind of spiritualization. I thought the very end was interesting with, she's trying to take a picture of it. She's trying to capture it or fix it or something, or to have an image of it to know how to relate to it.
I think that photographs and cameras, of course, are emblematic of a memory, to be able to capture a memory of it. But also, my sense in the dream is that the picture would provide proof of the miracle, evidence that this has happened, that she could then convincingly share with other people.
I'm also struck by this image of walking. And the song lyric, I'm walking. Yes, indeed, I'm walking. Keeps coming back of that she keeps walking. She starts out walking. She says, I can't just leave this little creature there. So we keep walking. Whatever she does, should we still keep on walking? It's so emblematic of a journey. And that, and what she seems to have done in her life and in the dream of keep going, persist. And that it really sort of parallels and echoes the process of the metamorphosis from nut to fetal kitten to wounded bird to, the spiritual dove that is such a symbol in the 2,000 years of Christianity of grace.
It's a really beautiful dream. And I'm so curious, given that it happened about 2 years ago, what has gone on for this dreamer in the subsequent time?
Mm-hmm.
I also could interpret this dream in a somewhat cautionary way, that the center of the dream with the tiny creature, the kitten, the bird, are all images of enormous primal need, suffering, injury, and trauma. And the white bird can represent a spiritual bypass.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That in these terrible, torturous times in our lives, we can vault upward towards a very grand, spiritualized way of talking about it. I often hear this phrase, well, it's all in right order.
Yeah.
And then the thought process will just suddenly stop,
Mm-hmm.
which is a way of just deciding it's all very high up in the air.
I totally get you. And I think that the stuff at the end with the cell phone and a survey kept popping up. It's like, it's not so easy to relate to that energy of the bird. It's kind of gotten away from her a little bit. I think this dream probably legitimately shows this process that she's undergone, because there is this sense, Deb, you talked about the walking. It is a journey. She just kind of, It's kind of makes me think, when you're going through something difficult, what do? You just put one foot in front of the other, Yep. And that's kind of what you just keep on doing the next right thing. You keep your ragtag group together and you just keep on walking. And I think that probably allowed her to get through that dark time, and that the dream is sort of showing that. But the end, it's a little bit ambivalent, the ending to this dream. How is she going to relate to this bird? There's a question about that, because I found myself happy that she was able to get a picture of it. But that wasn't an uncomplicated process. And so kind of integrating this experience without letting it just become a bypass is another job in itself, I think.
Yeah, I think the ending does point to how will she integrate this experience in the dream. And here's this very mundane stuff. There's a survey on the screen. I curse. I search my bag for another phone. And I'm imagining, that the fact that it happened would be enough, rather than having some numinous experience and having to default to a mechanical device to record it and hold it, that we would hold it in ourselves. So there may well be a process of integration that is also in process.
I'd like to also lean into an even darker possibility in the dream. Of course, I don't know this person, but just looking at the dream itself, that given the images of tremendous suffering, and then the appearance of the white bird with, zinnia flowers growing out of its feathers, it could be interpreted as a psychotic element. That people can reach such a depth of suffering and dissolution that the unconscious and mythic world breaks up into the psyche, and we're walking down the road and magical, mythical things begin to happen, begin to intrude upon our lives. If that were the case, if there was a psychotic break, or the potential for that, the camera can also represent a way of trying to retrospect on that breakdown, just as we were talking about Jung earlier, in an attempt to make meaning of this intrusion of unconscious content and trying to both talk about it to oneself and perhaps talk about it and describe it to other people.
I think I would see that as both of those possibilities that you brought forward, Joseph, as just a bigger question of whether this dream is compensatory, that something wonderful has to happen in the psyche to compensate for a very hard time that the dreamer herself may still be going through and her own suffering.
I'm going to say I get what you're both saying, and I think, Deb, you're framing as, is it compensatory is right on. I'm going to put my vote, though, that it's not.
Okay.
because it's a very well organized dream. It has a very clear narrative structure, and the process of that this thing is going through it's a very clear process. It's a nut. It's some kind of little pinky sized thing. It's a fetal cat. It's a bird. It's and that kind of process, I've seen that kind of process in many people's dreams, actually, over a period of time, where they're dreaming out, like they dream about some incredibly fragile, vulnerable little fetal animal that's in a box, and they'll have dreams sort of like that for a while, and then they'll be dreaming about kittens, and then they'll be dreaming about a cat with a gaping wound, and then like eventually it's a more kind of integrated sort of image, and it seems like she has all of that imagery in one dream. So there is a kind of summation here, and the fact that that this is following a progress, that there is a process that's been undergone here, and it's even kind of alluded to with the alchemical operations, makes me feel like there's been a kind of coagulatio here, that the psyche has gone through sort of a total collapse and has rebuilt itself, and that's what she reports. So that's what I'm seeing in this dream. But we can agree to disagree, or there's more than one possibility, and we don't really know.
And sometimes all the possibilities are there. That they're all there in a range, like colors, like the flowers at the end. All of those things are there, and that can be part of what it means to be whole.
Yeah.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show, and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.